My name is Samantha Reed, and for 27 years, my family made me feel like I was the least important person in the room. On Christmas Eve, my father and sister finally made their opinion clear when they packed their bags and drove away without me. They locked the front door behind them and left me standing alone in the freezing snow. My sister Vanessa rolled down the car window, smiled, and said, "Maybe now you finally understand where you belong." My father didn't even look back because he believed my military career had made me a disappointment to the family. They thought I would cry, beg them to come back, or spend the holiday alone feeling sorry for myself. Instead, I stood there silently, checked the time on my phone, and made one call that changed everything. 6 hours later, I walked through the doors of their luxury mountain retreat wearing my formal military uniform. But I wasn't alone, because walking beside me was a 4-star general my father had spent 3 years desperately trying to impress. And the moment my father recognized the man standing next to me, the smile disappeared from his face. I had spent 5 years serving as a captain in the United States Air Force, but my father never considered that a real accomplishment. My father, Richard Reed, owned Reed Defense Systems, a mid-sized defense contracting company he had built through decades of relentless ambition. To him, success was measured in contracts, expensive cars, executive titles, and the names of powerful people saved in his phone. My older sister, Vanessa, understood that world perfectly, which was why Dad treated her like his chosen successor. She wore designer clothes, attended corporate dinners, and spent most of her time beside him in boardrooms. I chose something completely different when I entered the military academy instead of joining my father's company. From that moment forward, Dad treated my decision like a personal insult. At every family gathering, he found some way to remind me that my military salary could never compete with Vanessa's executive lifestyle. Vanessa made it worse by constantly joking about my uniform, my small apartment, and the fact that I still followed orders for a living. I learned to smile through it, because arguing with them never changed anything. But what my family didn't understand was that my military career had taken me places they couldn't even imagine. For the previous 3 years, I had worked as a tactical liaison and procurement analyst for a specialized defense division. My responsibilities involved reviewing technical compliance, ethical standards, and contractor qualifications for major government programs. In simple terms, I helped determine which private defense companies were trustworthy enough to receive federal contracts. I couldn't tell my family everything about my work, but I knew exactly how much influence my position carried. And ironically, Reed Defense Systems was currently fighting for one of the biggest contracts it had ever pursued. My father needed a $50 million defense subcontract to keep his company financially stable. He had spent years trying to get the right people to notice him, especially one particular 4-star general. That general was Arthur Reed, my father's estranged older brother and my uncle. And neither my father nor Vanessa knew how closely I worked with him. Uncle Arthur had left the family decades earlier because he couldn't tolerate my father's obsession with money and status. While Richard built a corporate empire, Arthur dedicated his life to military service and eventually rose to the highest levels of leadership. Their relationship had deteriorated so badly that they barely spoke anymore. Yet my father still wanted Arthur's approval because his signature could influence the future of Reed Defense Systems. Arthur knew my father professionally, but he also knew exactly what kind of man Richard could be behind closed doors. On Christmas Eve morning, I came downstairs with my suitcase packed, expecting to travel with my family to Blackwood Pines Resort. Instead, I found several vehicles running in the driveway and everyone's luggage already loaded. Vanessa stood beside my father's SUV, holding a cup of coffee, watching me with a smile that immediately told me something was wrong. Dad checked his expensive watch and said, "There's no room for extra baggage, Samantha." Then he added the words that hurt more than the freezing air. This weekend is strictly for people who add value to the family name." Vanessa laughed quietly as she climbed into the vehicle, and I watched the doors close one after another. Before the SUV pulled away, she lowered her window and gave me one final look. "Maybe now you finally understand where you belong," she said. Then the front door locked behind me as their cars disappeared down the snowy mountain road. For several seconds, I simply stood there watching their taillights vanish between the trees. I could have called my father and demanded an explanation, but I already knew what he would say. So instead, I walked around the side of the house and reached underneath an old stone planter. Years earlier, I had hidden a spare manual key there, back when I was still a teenager. I unlocked the house, carried my suitcase upstairs, and sat quietly in my old bedroom. That was when my phone began vibrating on the nightstand. The number belonged to a secure government exchange, and I immediately recognized the caller. It was General Arthur Reed, my uncle, and one of the most respected officers in the defense community. "Captain Reed," he said when I answered, "how is Christmas Eve going?" I tried to sound normal, but he immediately noticed the hesitation in my voice. When I told him my family had already left without me, there was a long silence on the other end. "They left you alone in that house on Christmas Eve?" he finally asked. I told him they had made it clear that the retreat was only for people involved in the family business. His voice became colder, and I could hear the commander returning to his tone. "Pack your formal dress uniform," he said. "My staff car will be at your gate in 45 minutes. I asked where we were going, and his answer made me realize that Christmas was about to become very interesting. "The Regional Defense Gala is being held at Blackwood Pines tonight," Arthur explained. "I was scheduled to attend as the guest of honor, and protocol requires my chief liaison officer to accompany me." I froze when I realized exactly what he was saying. The same resort where my father had deliberately excluded me was hosting a private event attended by his biggest investors. Arthur wasn't inviting me as a pity gesture. He was inviting me because my work mattered, and he wanted me beside him. 45 minutes later, a government vehicle arrived outside my father's house. I changed into my formal dress uniform, carefully polished my medals, and walked outside without looking back. For the first time that day, I wasn't wondering whether my family valued me. I already knew the answer, and I was finally beginning to understand that their opinion didn't define me. The drive to Blackwood Pines took nearly 2 hours because of the heavy snowfall. Inside the vehicle, Arthur and I talked about everything except my family. He asked about my work, my goals, and the logistics program I had been helping oversee. He treated me like a professional officer rather than the daughter my father constantly dismissed. When we finally arrived, the resort was glowing with thousands of lights against the dark mountain sky. Luxury vehicles filled the entrance, and prominent defense executives were gathering inside for the private reception. The moment the official vehicle stopped, several staff members rushed forward to greet Arthur. I stepped out beside him wearing my uniform, my posture straight, and my medals shining under the entrance lights. Inside the ballroom, my father was surrounded by investors, while Vanessa stood beside him in an expensive designer gown. Neither of them knew that the person they had abandoned that morning was about to walk into their most important night. The ballroom doors opened, and Arthur entered first with me beside him. Vanessa noticed me immediately, and her expression changed from surprise to irritation. She probably thought I had somehow found a way to crash the event after being excluded. My father turned toward the doorway expecting another investor, and then his eyes landed on Arthur. Everything changed in less than a second. His face became pale, his hand froze around his glass, and the chair behind him crashed onto the floor. The room became unusually quiet as every executive turned to see what had happened. Dad forced a smile and walked toward Arthur, pretending that nothing strange had happened that morning. "Arthur, we had no idea you were coming," he said nervously. Then he looked at me and added, "Samantha, there must have been some terrible misunderstanding." Arthur didn't shake his hand. Instead, he looked directly at my father and said, "Save the performance, Richard." The words were quiet, but everyone in the room heard them. "There was no misunderstanding," Arthur continued. "You deliberately left your daughter outside because you believed her service had no value to your corporate ambitions." My father glanced around the room, suddenly aware that dozens of important people were listening. Vanessa stepped forward and tried to defend him by saying the retreat was for corporate stakeholders. She claimed I didn't understand high-level defense operations and had no place in their discussions. Arthur turned toward her and calmly asked if she understood who had been reviewing the contracts connected to Reed Defense Systems. Vanessa's confidence disappeared when Arthur revealed that I served as his division's chief procurement and compliance liaison. Every proposal submitted by my father's company eventually passed through the system I helped oversee. The room fell silent as investors began exchanging uncomfortable looks. My father suddenly understood that the daughter he had called a disappointment wasn't powerless at all. For years, he had judged me by my salary while completely ignoring the responsibility behind my uniform. Now he was standing in front of the very people he wanted to impress, realizing that his treatment of me could have serious consequences. "Samantha," he said quietly, "you know how important this contract is." I looked at him and remembered every family gathering where he had mocked my career. I remembered Vanessa laughing at my uniform and telling relatives that I had chosen the easy path because I couldn't handle business. I remembered standing outside that morning while they drove away without me. Then I finally said something I had wanted to say for years. "Leadership is built on character, Dad, not money, titles, or the people you can impress." Arthur stepped forward and addressed the room. He explained that federal defense contracts were based on trust, compliance, transparency, and ethical conduct. A company could have brilliant engineers and expensive offices, but none of that mattered if its leadership couldn't be trusted. Then came the sentence my father had spent years trying to avoid. Reed Defense Systems has been formally disqualified from the upcoming subcontract due to critical compliance failures. Vanessa dropped into a nearby chair and covered her face with her hands. My father stood motionless as investors began quietly leaving the room. The same people who had been laughing with him minutes earlier suddenly wanted distance from his company. His carefully constructed reputation was collapsing in front of the audience he had worked so hard to impress. And I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. I walked outside with Arthur while snow continued falling across the resort grounds. For the first time, I realized I didn't need revenge against my family. Their own decisions had already created consequences they couldn't escape. That night, instead of returning to the empty house, I joined Arthur at a private military gathering near the base. There were no expensive executives, fake smiles, or conversations about corporate status. There were simply people laughing, sharing stories, and treating one another with genuine respect. Sitting beside the fireplace, I finally understood what family was supposed to feel like. Not a place where you constantly prove your worth, but a place where your worth is never questioned. The consequences for my father came quickly after that Christmas. Without the federal contract, Reed Defense Systems faced serious financial pressure and an extensive corporate review. Several investors withdrew their support, and my father eventually stepped down from the board to prevent the company from collapsing completely. Vanessa lost the executive position she had expected to inherit and suddenly had to face the professional world without Dad protecting her. They called me repeatedly over the following months. Some calls were angry, some were emotional, and others were desperate apologies. I didn't answer because I had spent enough years explaining myself to people who had already decided not to listen. 6 months later, I received an official promotion to major and accepted a new position leading an advanced logistics division. I packed my belongings and left the childhood home behind without regret. The snow that once represented rejection had become the place where I finally discovered my own worth. Looking back, I realize my family didn't lose me on Christmas Eve. They simply showed me that they had never understood me in the first place. My father thought success meant owning a company, while I learned that real success meant earning trust. Vanessa thought wearing expensive clothes made her important, while I learned that respect comes from how you treat people when nobody is watching. They left me standing in the cold because they believed I had nowhere else to go. They never imagined that I had built a life where my value wasn't determined by their approval. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. Sometimes it's walking away, becoming stronger, and refusing to let their cruelty define your future. If this story reminded you that your worth doesn't depend on how your family treats you, stay with Chronicles for more stories of betrayal, resilience, and unexpected karma. Because sometimes, the person everyone treats like the family disappointment is the one who eventually discovers they never needed the family's approval at all. The story's strongest payoff comes from the contrast between family rejection and earned respect, making the Christmas Eve confrontation at Blackwood Pines the ideal thumbnail and opening hook for the video.